Order. Urgent question. Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if she will make a statement on progress establishing the inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal.
Minister Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s was an appalling tragedy that should never have happened. Victims and their families have endured so much pain and hardship, and they deserve answers about how this could have happened. I am very grateful to the Honourable Lady for bringing this issue to the House today, Mr. Speaker, and for her leadership alongside other honourable and right honourable members across this House on the all-party parliamentary group, which has done such consistent and constructive work on this issue. And indeed, as she will know, I myself have been part of that group over time and worked for my constituents, as I know all honourable and right honourable members in this House have done. Mr. Speaker, as the House will know, following the Prime Minister's announcement in July last year that there would be an inquiry into these terrible events, the Department for Health launched a consultation on what the form and scope of that inquiry should be. I would like to thank all those who contributed to that process. We understand how difficult and painful describing these events must have been. The responses to that consultation were carefully considered by Cabinet Office officials. We listened to victims' concerns, and as a result, we confirmed that the inquiry would be statutory, is established under the Inquiries Act, and we moved sponsorship of the inquiry from the Department for Health to the Cabinet Office. Before Christmas, we went further and announced that the inquiry would be chaired by a judge. We have asked the Lord Chief Justice to provide us with a nomination, and we hope to announce the name of that judge very soon. Once the appointment has been announced, the Cabinet Office will have early discussions with the Chair about setting up the inquiry and will encourage the Chair to quickly hold further consultation with the affected communities over the inquiry's terms of reference. I would just like to add to this initial part of this exchange my personal commitment to seeing this be done, and that of all of my colleagues in government. This is a vital issue. I think we are all fighting on the same side of this to ensure justice for those victims of a terrible tragedy and scandal.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you first of all for granting this urgent question this afternoon. Can I thank the Minister for her response and of course welcome her to her new place, and say that I know she had a constituent affected by the scandal and understands what this is about. 6.5 months have now passed since the announcement of this inquiry. The previous Minister for the Cabinet Office had set out his intention to appoint a chair before Christmas, and that didn't happen. We were then promised a statement in the new year, and it's been nearly a month now and no further progress. It took precious months and the intervention from the former Bishop of Liverpool and chair of the Hillsborough inquiry to persuade the government to move the inquiry from the implicated Department of Health. This was achieved by working with all those affected in a unifying way, and I'm concerned that in recent consultative meetings with the Cabinet Office, this approach has not continued. Now, not only have we seen a change of minister, but we understand from press reports that the senior civil servant responsible for the inquiry is now due to leave the Cabinet Office. So we have 3 questions for the Minister. Firstly, will she publish a clear timetable setting out when she intends to appoint a chair, agree the terms of reference and specify the date that the inquiry will meet? Secondly, will she commit to a Families First inquiry with evidence taken in regional hubs across the UK and with a public-facing inquiry secretariat working with all those affected? It's absolutely essential that the inquiry chair adopts this approach and is able to work alongside a panel of experts. Finally, will she confirm that the terms of reference will be set independently by the chair following a consultation with all those affected? And will the terms cover the aftermath of the scandal rather than just the run-up? This is a treatment disaster of huge proportions in which the government is implicated. It's taken the lives of 2,400 people already and blighted the lives of many more. And for those who've died in the last 6 months, Justice delayed is justice denied. The lack of progress is causing huge distress and upset for those families affected. The Minister must now take immediate steps to secure for this community the truth and the justice which they have been denied for far too long.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have actually seen a copy of the letter that the Honourable Lady sent to you this morning in relation to this urgent question, and so I have come prepared with the answers to the points in that letter. And if you will allow me, Mr. Speaker, I hope to be able to answer her points. If I may say, first of all, I will reiterate what I've said first of all, that we intend to be making a further statement about the Chair very shortly. I take her point that there should be no further delay. I agree with her point that there should be no further delay. The Government is committed to getting this right and getting this done as quickly as possible for all of the reasons that she has already set out. So on the point, first of all, that this could have been done quicker. I think, first of all, it is important that the consultation that was launched by the Department of Health was allowed to reach its conclusion, so that all those who wish to contribute had the chance to do so. As soon as that was complete, a very early decision was taken to transfer the sponsorship to the Cabinet Office, in line with the strong feeling of respondents, and I think it is important that we have listened to that and acted accordingly. Following the written ministerial statement made by the Cabinet Office in November, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made a further statement before Christmas, confirming that the inquiry would be judge-led, which I think reflects the gravity and the complexity of the issues to be considered. Again, it is a point on which we had listened to those who had responded, who were asking for it to be judge-led, and we agree. So we now understand the importance, the absolute imperative importance of getting this inquiry underway as soon as possible, and as I say, we'll be making a further statement as soon as possible. She asks about regional hubs and about whether the inquiry will put families first. Mr. Speaker, the Government will ensure the inquiry has the resources it needs to complete its work. It will, of course, also be independent of government, which is another theme she's referred to in her questions. I'm not, of course, in a position, therefore, to answer every single one of her questions, because that would be for an independent chair to complete, to be able to answer all of those questions she has put, for example, about the fine detail of the terms of reference. But, given the sensitivity of the issues under consideration, the Chair will no doubt be focused on ensuring that all those affected have every opportunity to participate in the inquiry process. As the Honourable Lady has mentioned, the former First Secretary of State held a number of meetings with representatives from the affected communities. Government, of course, will be more than happy to continue that engagement if it is necessary, and I am confident, moreover, that the Chair of the inquiry will take that up and want to hear views and testimony from, of course, all those affected across the UK. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady did ask explicitly about the terms of reference, and I do expect that the Chair will want to consult the affected community on the terms of reference. Once the Chair has done so and has made a recommendation to the Minister for the Cabinet Office, there will, of course, be a further statement to this House setting out what the scope of the inquiry will be. Mr. Speaker, I reiterate, I want to ensure that those affected get the answers they deserve as quickly as possible, and that they receive what many have been asking for, in that this is a judge-led inquiry which will be independent and I hope will be effective in getting to answers.
My honourable friend, the Minister, is new in post and has a phenomenal reputation in the previous departments she's been in for getting things done. Will she now take a personal grip on this issue and give it the kickstart it needs?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for, I think, some undeserved compliments, but he is absolutely correct. I do personally wish to see this done. As, in fact, the Honourable Lady for Hull has already mentioned, I have constituents, as many honourable members and right honourable members in this House do. I have constituents affected by this. I think this is a national disgrace, and I want to see it put right. I do take, therefore, that personal passion that has been asked on me there, and I have pressed my officials to move on this as quickly as we possibly can.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for raising this important issue and echo the concerns that she and other colleagues in this House have raised. The victims of this appalling tragedy have been waiting decades for answers and for justice. And it is unacceptable that they are now having to wait even longer as the government misses its own deadlines. Mr Speaker, this simply isn't good enough. It's been over 6.5 months since the government first committed to an inquiry on this tragedy. So can the Minister today finally commit to a clear timetable for action, including the appointment of chair and the setting of terms and reference, because as soon as possible is not going to be good enough for those families and victims who are listening to this statement, who have seen this issue kicked into the long grass for too long. Can she also provide an explanation for why the government has failed to do so to date? It is vital that families are put first and the government avoids the failings that have plagued the ongoing inquiries into child abuse and Grenfell, with the resulting loss in confidence in both. So could the Minister outline what lessons have been learnt from these inquiries and how she intends to ensure that the voices of families and victims are heard throughout the inquiry process?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I believe I have already answered those questions in answer to the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull North, but I will reiterate that the government expects to be able to announce the name of the judge leading this inquiry as soon as possible, very shortly indeed. Mr Speaker, you have already heard me refer to my personal interest in seeing this happen, and the same goes for every member of this government. This is too important an issue to play party politics with, which I'm sure the Honourable Lady for the Labour frontbench was not doing. But nonetheless, let me reiterate that I too want to see this done for the sake of victims and for the sake of those who have asked that this should be a judge-led inquiry. That means getting it right. That means taking what's necessary time is there to do this properly. Not more time than is necessary, but the right amount of time that is needed. And I want there to be confidence in this inquiry that it will get to the root of the answers.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to set up a full inquiry and to allocate a judge. But the recent consultation, Mr Speaker, had 800 responses, so can my right honourable friend assure me that those people will all get an individual response and that families and victims will always be at the heart of this, Mr Speaker, because they have waited for far too long for answers?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for that impassioned and thoughtful contribution to this. I would prefer to answer her point around the individual responses. I think once the government has had a chance to be able to discuss that with the chair of the inquiry, it is important that that person, once appointed, is able to properly engage with victims and with those who have responded to the consultation, and indeed to do a small amount of further consultation as well, including upon the terms of reference. That much was clear in the written ministerial statement to this House, Mr Speaker, by the Prime Minister. So I will return to her with the specific answer to her question, but I do expect that the chair, once appointed, will take a very, very close interest in properly answering those who have taken time and effort, and those who are, of course, quite ill in taking that time and effort in responding to that consultation. As I said earlier on, we are very grateful to them for that time in doing so, and certainly I want to see them well treated and respected in this process.
Mr Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking the member for Kingston upon Hull North for asking this urgent question and to pay tribute to her work for continually pressing to ensure justice for the victims and families affected by this tragic scandal. As others have pointed out already, campaigners were told that the chair of the inquiry would be in place before Christmas, yet we are still waiting. When will this actually happen? Can we define shortly? And after finally doing the right thing and taking the inquiry away from the Department of Health, will the Government now ensure that the inquiry look at all matters, including documents, patient records and things that were altered and that hidden things behind public interest barriers will be opened up so that light can be shed fully on this whole matter? And my last point is, will the inquiry have broad enough terms to let those in Scotland also give evidence?
Thank you. Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for those points on behalf of his bench. I mentioned earlier on that I expect the chair to be able to take evidence all the way around the UK, so I hope his last point is answered by that. I also said earlier on that the government will of course ensure that this inquiry has the resources it requires. I will come back to him on the specific list of types of information he just gave there. And then, finally, Mr. Speaker, to be absolutely clear, I am saying to the House today that we expect to be able to announce the name of the judge shortly. I am not able to give it greater definition than that. I know that answers his first question. I hope that may answer a question that others may put. We expect to be able to announce that name shortly.
John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cabinet Office taking responsibility for this inquiry is a good thing. Will it also mean that the Department of Health can really be investigated fairly and rigorously?
Minister.
Yes.
Thank you. Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reassure families like the Smiths, who lost their son aged just 7 and who have fought tirelessly over decades for justice and answers, that the government truly mean it when they say there'll be no further delay and that the public inquiry will get it right this time? These families have been through so much, we just cannot let them down again.
Yeah. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady speaks for so many of us in our roles as constituency MPs. We all feel for families such as that, and we can all relate, I think, that experience to other tragedies that we know of in our constituencies. I would very much like the word to go to the Smith family and others who may be listening to this, that yes, we mean every word of what we say here today, that we all wish to see this inquiry completed with no further delay, as effectively as possible, such that they may get the answers they deserve and perhaps may be able to move on from there.
Rachel McLean.
I thank very much the Minister for coming today and reaffirming her commitment and her personal interest in this issue. I also represent a constituent who's been suffering for decades, so I'm sure that she will welcome that this is a priority for her. Can she also say that it's a priority for the government as a whole, for her senior colleagues in Cabinet? I'm sure that message would be very welcomed if she can confirm it.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I most certainly can. Provide that reassurance to the House today. I think you will know by the fact that it was the Prime Minister herself who laid the written ministerial statement that we've referred to, that the passion for resolving this issue and for being able to move an inquiry forward goes right to the top of this government, as it absolutely should do. We are all agreed that this is a tragedy that should never have happened, and we are determined to see it put right.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, I don't doubt can I commend my honourable friend, the member for Hull North, on her tenacity in following up this issue. And I don't doubt for a minute the Minister's commitment in wanting to see this resolved. But she has been sent here today with a message, this having been kicked into the long grass, with a message telling us that the government is deliberating on what lawnmower to use. I mean, the interference of the Department of Health on the terms of reference was wholly unwelcome. And if this is going to be an independent inquiry, the judge who leads it has to set the parameters of what happened prior to the incidents and then post how these people were treated. And they must set their own terms of reference.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, indeed they must, and that's why I, for example, was unable to answer one of his colleagues' questions, asking me to provide that terms of reference and to bring it here to the House, or to give a timetable for when I would do so. He is, in fact, exactly right. It is for an independent judge to be able to do all those things, rightly so. Now, I dispute his analogy of cutting grass. I think, in fact, that makes slightly light of a situation. I think the fact here is that we have listened to the concerns of those who saw that the Department of Health was not the correct body to do this. We have responded. We've listened to those who said we would like a judge to lead this inquiry. We have responded. We are doing the right things in response to what victims have asked, and it does take a little amount of time to put that in place, and I hope it will then deliver the correct answers.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Inquiries Act 2005, under which this inquiry is established, imposes legal obligations in the government to consult with devolved governments. I would ask the Minister, and given her previous experience just recently, how that is happening in relation to Northern Ireland, where there are no ministers. It's all very well to consult with the civil servants, but there is a legal obligation to consult with government ministers, so I'd be grateful if she could clarify that.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising that important point. He will have heard me say already that this inquiry and that the judge to lead it will of course wish to engage with victims all the way around the UK. But I think it might be simplest if I write to him with the specific legal answer he is seeking as to how that will be properly carried out in respect of the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I pay tribute to my colleague for Hull North for getting this question and to you for granting it. Despite losing their son many years ago, my constituents Maureen and Les Dodd were only able to come and see me thanks to the intervention of the former Member of Parliament for Lee, Mr Andy Burnham. They said their son Graham Jonathan Dodd was courageous, witty, funny and inspirational. I know that the Minister will be thinking of all of those who've lost someone today. Can I ask her, has she read Bishop James Jones's report into the experience of the Hillsborough families? Because there are many lessons to be learnt, and will she make sure a copy of it is distributed to all officials who work on the forthcoming inquiry?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I have not yet had a chance to read that report, but I should be happy to look into it and share it with officials.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
There are nearly 300 sufferers of the scandal in Wales, and given that health is a devolved matter, will she commit to ensure not only a voice for Welsh families, but also that full consideration is given to the aftermath and its implications for health services in Wales?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, again, I welcome her raising that point because in concert with her colleagues here today from Scotland and Northern Ireland, it allows us to get the full, begin to get the full picture of what's required across the devolved space here. I do not think I can speak for the judge in how he or she will constitute those who conduct the inquiry alongside him or her. So in terms of whether there will be a Welsh voice, I am not able to answer that question as it's been framed. I will reiterate that I certainly would expect the judge to be able to listen to Welsh victims with no hesitation whatsoever, and I think that's very much the right thing to do. I will be happy to come back to her, as I have said to other colleagues, should there be more detailed questions about the relationship to the devolved settlement, if that would help her.
Gordon Marsden.
Mr Speaker, like the Minister, I have constituents affected by this terrible situation, and I welcome the letter that I've had today from her right honourable friend, confirming, as she has done today, that the families will be consulted on the terms of reference before they are set. However, I have one of my constituents who actually stopped me in the street back in the autumn, who I've not met before but had written, and he said something very telling to me. He said, "We've been victims once. We don't want to be victims again because of prevarication or other circumstances." So will the Minister take that on board? And in particular, in thinking of my constituent in Blackpool, will she also take on board the need for there to be, as some have said, regional hubs so that people who are either not able to come to London or, frankly, not capable of coming to London will have their proper opportunity to give their voice?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do very much sympathise with the point he's put, and in fact I'm glad his constituent has been able to have his voice echoed here today in this chamber. I think the honourable gentleman makes the point for many of us that we can all think of constituents who are too ill to travel and have been too ill for too long. This is a matter of too much time having been taken over the many course of years since the 70s and 80s for this to have been put right, and I think it is a good thing that it is now being put right and that there will be a judge-led inquiry. I will ensure, of course, that the judge that is appointed hears that reflection from his constituent that he puts there today. And I will, just for the benefit of the House, Mr Speaker, reiterate what was in the written ministerial statement in December last year by the Prime Minister, where she said that everyone who contributed to the findings of the consultation will be passed to the proposed chair to help inform the discussions regarding the draft terms of reference on which we expect there will be further consultation. So I'd like to reassure the House that there shall be that further level of involvement, which I think is appropriate and important.
Mr Geoffrey Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. is the Minister aware that this is indeed a matter that affects the whole House? I wouldn't think there's an MP whose constituents have not been affected one way or another. Is she also aware it goes back to the mid-70s, far back as Callaghan's government, perhaps even Wilson's, and that it has been carried on, the cover-up, effectively, has been carried on under all governments, and so it's an all-party issue too. It's to this government's credit, finally we have an inquiry that I believe we first called for in recent times, Mr Speaker, when you were in the chair. We had the very first backbench committee debate, and that was in 1915, I think. Coming now to the present, it's vital, having taken this initiative, 2015, the Minister now sees to it that the inquiry is genuinely independent and that there is no withholding of documents, because the prevailing attitude that we have come up against, who have been involved in this, is of retention of sensitive documents by both the Department of Health and the NHS itself, and no public indemnity certificates or any of that kind should be used to prevent us from getting at the truth as to what happened.
Order. I remember that first backbench business committee debate on the matter well, including, if memory serves me correctly, a government whip rather impertinently rebuking me for the non-selection of a government amendment. I didn't think at the time he quite realised that we were into new territory. The clue's in the title, backbench business. No requirement to select a government amendment, especially if it's a wrecking one. Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think I too remember that backbench business debate, because I also was here again speaking on behalf of my constituents, as many of us were. I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his contribution there and for his recognition that this is a cross-party affair, and it has been because of the length of time over the decades that it has taken for it to come to today. And I do also particularly welcome his recognition that the government is now acting, and in his words deserves credit for doing that. I will take his point, as I said to the honourable gentleman from the SNP front bench, that there are certain categories of documents that will be desirable in executing this inquiry. As I said before, the government will be putting, of course, all the resources necessary to the inquiry to complete its work, and I think we would all wish to see this being comprehensive, independent, as he has reiterated, and effective for those families who need the answers after too many years.
Mr Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've spoken to about the experiences of my own constituent David and others who were affected by this tragedy, and it's also of great interest to members of the All-Party Group on HIV and AIDS, given the numbers of individuals who were infected by HIV, some of course who went on to develop AIDS and to die from AIDS in a absolute national disgrace. But I must press the Minister further. Can she say whether we are talking about days, weeks or months until the judge is appointed and this inquiry gets underway?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we are indeed talking about very shortly. It certainly will not be months, it will be very shortly, and I look forward to being able to bring that announcement very shortly back before the House.
Mr David Hanson.
My constituents just want this over and to get their lives back on track. Could the Minister tell me that when she does appoint the judge will be full-time on this, and has she any anticipation of when recommendations will finally be made?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, unfortunately I'm not able to answer that question. I do not have that answer with me today. However, I shall make sure that either I or the Secretary of State writes to him.
Jamie Stone.
Mr Speaker, can I, on behalf of my party, welcome the Minister to her place? And I do recognise the constructive nature of her answers. Will the Minister guarantee full consultation of groups such as the Haemophilia Society, the Hepatitis C Trust and Tainted Blood in the Contaminated Blood inquiry?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I mentioned in answer to another Right Honourable member, the Government has already committed through the statement that the Prime Minister made to this House in December that there will be further consultation with those who have been affected in order to be able to set the terms of reference and for the Chair to be able to commence their I certainly expect that that will involve both individuals or indeed family members and then representative groups.
Catherine West.
Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the Honourable Lady is aware, the Minister is aware, there is a two-tier approach to families who are affected at the moment. Would it stop the Minister looking at that two-tier nature or the postcode lottery which exists for different people now? Because as she said before, so many people are very, very ill right now and there are differing patterns across the UK. Could she look at bringing those into alignment, perhaps even in advance of the review?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to her for that question, and what I will say is I shall pass that to my colleagues in the Department for Health who remain responsible for the policy in relation to victims and indeed the funding as it operates today. The inquiry for which I'm answering today is about how this came about and about the more historical nature of things, but I shall ensure that her questions, which are of course in the minds of many honourable members in relation of constituents today and they're suffering now, but I shall ensure that the Department for Health hears those and may be able to provide her with an answer.
Mrs. Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister must be tolerant if there is a sort of a cynicism about the Shortley. There's an urgent question from my honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Hull North, that brought us here in July, when we asked urgently for the inquiry to be moved under the orbit of the Cabinet Office. That took 4 months. We were promised a judge in December. We're still waiting. Is Shortley, given that we're now at the end of January, before the end of February? Can we at least give ourselves some hope that we're not going to have another urgent question from my honourable friend bringing us back here again, nagging for a decision?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think we will need to trouble either you or honourable members for another urgent question. I do expect this to be very prompt in being able to return to the House with an update. The update that the House quite rightly asks for and that quite rightly our constituents and the victims of this scandal require. We are working hard and fast on doing this so that it is the victims who come first and can be served by a judge as quickly as possible.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With respect, the Minister has said nothing to advance this matter today. I've been supporting affected constituents in declining health for 8 years, which sounds a long time, but is a fraction of the time that victims have waited for justice. So does she now regret the 4-month delay in moving the inquiry from the Department of Health to the Cabinet Office, as my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull asked last July?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I'm not sure the honourable gentleman's tone really helps here. I have endeavoured to answer every question as constructively as I possibly can, and I think I have made it clear my personal commitment and that of the government to ensuring that this matter is brought as quickly as possible to a conclusion for the benefit of the victims for whom every honourable member here wishes to speak. The government has listened and responded by making this a judge-led inquiry. I think that is the right thing to do. It has listened and responded by removing it from the Department for Health and turning it to the Cabinet Office. I think it has been important to take what little time has been needed to get that right in order that it can be a better inquiry that better answers what victims have been asking for.
Thank you. Order.